I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you to Beyond for inviting me, and to Anna Velada to her kind invitation. I wish it was under slightly more encouraging circumstances that I was speaking about gender hostility today, considering this morning's outcome. But there you go. So what I'm going to do over the next 20 minutes or so is explore whether gender, or what I call gender hostility, should be included within hate crime policies and hate crime legislation. I think before I do that, it's helpful for us to just... Does this work? Okay, I'll use that. Just for us to very briefly remind ourselves what hate crime is, and I know we all know what hate crime is, that's why we're here. But I think it's just helpful in terms of understanding whether gender fits within what I call the hate crime paradigm. Just very briefly talk a little bit about what we mean when we use the word hate and what we mean by the term hate crime. So it has to be an offence, so we would have a criminal offence, and then on top of that we would have some form of either hatred or loathing, prejudice or animus, what I more broadly refer to as identity-based hostility, and what some people refer to as targeted abuse. Now, we've been talking a lot about hate crime over the last couple of days in terms of a number of different protected characteristics and different types of prejudice, and quite regularly, or commonly, we would refer to hate crime in terms of racism, or Islamophobia, or homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, or what was highlighted earlier as disableism. These are some of the common forms of prejudice that we often associate with hate-motivated offences, but often left outside of our public discussions and our policy discussions and even legal discussions of hate crime is misogyny, or what we might refer to more generally in legal terms as gender hostility. Now, misogyny refers to a dislike of women in particular, and of ingrained prejudice towards women. And so what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes or so now is just go through some of the examples of how women are the targets of abuse, which we might refer to as hate crime. And then I'm going to look at some of the arguments for and against inclusion of gender and gender hostility within the hate crime policy domain. And I think it's important to predicate that exploration on two important questions. I think that the policy debate and the debate that should be had by civil society organisations should be predicated on, first of all, whether gender hostility is what we call a significant social problem or not. Is this a specific social problem that requires a specific policy and legislative response? The second question is then to ask, even if it is, even if we say yes, there is a real social problem of women in particular being targeted for abuse, should it be treated the same as other types of hate crime? Or should it be dealt with specifically, but separately from hate crime? And these are the questions that we have to grapple with moving forward. So first of all then, is gender hostility a social problem? And I want to just provide some examples of how, over the last few years, it's become a particular problem, especially on, as we've already heard throughout the last couple of days, on social media. So you may or may not recognise these two individuals. A couple of years ago, there was a campaign in the UK for more women and more female figures to be depicted on our banknotes. Lots of old white men, but not too many women. So there was a campaign led by a number of individuals, including this lady on the left here. Her name is Caroline Criado Perez, who campaigned for the better representation of women on banknotes. And in response to that, she was trolled online quite viciously. People sent her death threats, threats of rape, and other misogynistic comments online. Now, the lady on the right is an MP, Stella Creasy. She then supported that campaign, and in turn herself was also subject to a number of threats and abuse online. And what Caroline said about that experience was that it's not about what women are doing, it's not about feminism, it's that some men don't like women and don't like women in the public domain. Now, what we refer to this more broadly often is everyday sexism or casual sexism. And it extends well beyond social media, of course, to everyday experiences of harassment, of what some men like to refer to as banter, or as locker room chat. Naming no names. But it is, in fact, quite frequently steeped in misogyny, against bias towards women, a way of denigrating women for who they are. And so the woman who fails to smile back on the train might become the bitch or the cow. The woman who doesn't respond with a big smile when she's walk whistled at becomes the ignorant cow. Okay? This banter can quite frequently and quite quickly turn very hostile and sometimes violent. And it's to the very most extreme forms of violence that I now turn, because this really is on a continuum from the everyday sexism of online abuse to what we might call the most extreme forms of gender hostility, such as rape and homicide. Some of you may recognise this gentleman, perhaps probably only Paul. He's another English chap by the name of Levi Belfield. He was a serial killer and serial rapist. He killed the young girl Millie Dowler, who was 13, who went missing. It was a very big case in the UK some time ago. He was convicted of a number of crimes, and the judge said that he was motivated by an unreasoning hatred towards especially blonde women. Acquaintances spoke of his intense loathing of women with blonde hair, who he called sluts, impure, people who deserved to be messed around with. Now, this is a clear example of where someone has a loathing, a hatred of women, and will go so far as to rape and kill their victims. And I suppose in the Norwegian context, that would be most centrally applied to Anders Breivik, who in his manifesto spoke about feminism and women in the 21st century as undermining and destroying Western society. And some writers have even suggested that he selected what he felt was the most beautiful young women to kill when he went on his rampage. 77 people were killed. So we have two ends of the spectrum there: everyday sexism, online abuse, extreme forms of hostility, but there is quite a lot in between. And I want to focus now, for the rest of this session, on whether you might think of rape as a hate crime. Now, I'm afraid I don't know the numbers in Norway, but recent statistics from the UK estimate that there are between 366,000 and 404,000 female victims of sexual offences each year. That's compared to between 54,000 and 90,000 male victims. And that there were, or are, 52,000 rapes against women each year compared to 6,000. And what that shows us is that being a woman is a risk factor in whether you experience sexual violence. And that's not to underplay male experiences of sexual violence. It's important. It needs to have a separate policy domain where there is focus and resources put into that. What these huge figures show is that sexual violence is gendered. That means that you are more likely to experience sexual violence simply because you are a woman. But does that mean that sexual violence is a form of gender hostility? Just because you are you're more likely to be selected, that's one thing, we might say that's gendered, but whether that is based on hatred or loathing, prejudice or animus, or identity-based hostility is a slightly different question. Okay? And we need to grapple with that in terms of answering our main question of whether gender should be included under hate crime legislation. How am I doing for time?
Okay.
Okay, good. So, for a long time now, feminists have argued, not just feminists, but in particular feminists have argued that rape is not just about sexual gratification, but it's about power, and it's about subjugating women. It's about putting women in their place, and it's about asserting or reasserting male authority. Now, Nicholas Groff provides a famous typology of rape offenders back in 1979, and he split rape into two types of offenders, what he calls power rape and anger rape. Some of you may be familiar with this, I'm sure. Power rapes refer to sexual intercourse as evidence of conquest. That is, dominance is achieved by overpowering women, thus asserting male authority over them. The other form of rape he classified as anger rapes, explained by reference to anger, rage, contempt, and, importantly, hatred. And those types of rapes were often marked by submitting victims to degrading sexual acts, to mutilation of body parts, to beating of women. Now, both of these types of rape, it is argued, attempt to subordinate and subjugate women because they are women. And it's led to certain authors, such as Susan Brown Miller in her famous book, Against Our Will, saying that rape is a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. It is a state of terror, a form of terrorism, what Caroline Sheffield refers to as sexual terrorism. That ripple effect that moves beyond the individual victim to cause fear and caution amongst all women who fear that they could be targeted simply because they are female. Okay, so there are a number of examples and I think quite cogent evidence to show that there is gender hostility in our society. It's on a spectrum. It sees and it comes through from social media. It certainly is evidenced with extreme forms of hostility where people are targeted, raped and killed. And there may be many, many other offences in between where women are selected not just because they're women, but because of hostility, a prejudice or a bias towards them and an intention to subjugate and to exert control over them because they're seen as women or female. Does that mean that rape and other forms of gender-based violence should be included in hate crime law? Well, here are some of the arguments for yes. There are lots of arguments, and I'm going to focus in particular on symbolic reasons. So a lot of my work around hate crime law focuses on the symbolic role that the law plays in shaping our society and shaping what is acceptable and not acceptable behaviour. So the first one is called express denunciation, symbolic denunciation, or censure. And that is that the law, and in particular hate crime law, sends out a message to society that certain types of prejudice, such as homophobia, such as racism, will not be tolerated in society. And those who are motivated by those prejudice and commit crimes will be punished, and will be punished more harshly. And one could argue, of course, that hate crime and hate crime law is a really important part of a social policy domain which attempts to erode the social acceptance of racist and homophobic attitudes, for example. We have hate crime law not just to hurt offenders and punish them, but as a declaration by the state and by society that we will not tolerate these forms of prejudice and prejudice-motivated behaviour in our society. The law will not tolerate that. So the question is, could these laws also help to erode our patriarchal social environment? This is an environment that not only tolerates vast amounts of sexual violence, year on and year out, but which supports a number of rape myths and what we call rape myth acceptance. These myths include that real rape can only be committed by strangers. Heard that one before? That victims will physically fight back if they've really been raped. That when women are intoxicated, they either want to be raped or at least they are partly to blame for being raped. That real victims will tell someone straight away and they won't hide it from other people. That when women say no, they quite often really mean yes. That men simply can't control their sexual urges, and that women should therefore know better, and if they wear short skirts or they flirt with men or even kiss them, then they somehow deserve to be raped. And of course, other myths include that women are prone to lying, making up false allegations, and therefore women, generally speaking, are not to be believed. And I can tell you these are pervasive beliefs that continue. There's lots of research and lots of studies to show that these rape myths do continue, and there is high acceptance levels of these myths amongst jurors. What they tell us is that sexual violence is not being conceptualized or understood as a form of gendered violence. But it's often supported through a patriarchal system which attempts to minimize victims' experiences. And we see this when victims aren't believed, when they're viewed with suspicion, when their sexual history evidence is put before the courts and they're portrayed as being promiscuous or slutty or not to be believed. And there are many ways in which we as a society can challenge that. We can challenge it through better education and awareness in universities, as is happening in my university at the moment, better training for prosecutors and police officers, better jury directions at court, victim support campaigns, stronger laws defining what consent is, and the obstruction of the use of sexual history evidence. But I argue that we need to go further. We need to, within our toolkit, include gender hostility within hate crime law so that we can use those laws to challenge these pervasive myths which are gendered, which are biased, which are prejudiced towards women, and which keep women in a state of fear, I'm almost there, and which therefore minimize their experiences as a victim of gender-based violence. So I think it's really important that we begin to reconceptualize our understanding of, in particular, rape and other forms of gender-based violence by saying that it isn't about the victim, it's not the fault of the victim, and that we need to reorientate our ideas of what sexual violence is to put blame on the offender. Now, hate crime law and hate crime policies puts that blame where it should lie, both in society and the offender who is motivated by some form of prejudice or hostility, and not because of what the victim said or did or wore or didn't say. Okay, so I've convinced myself that it should be included already. I don't know about you. I'm there. But there are, of course, arguments not to include rape and other forms of gendered violence within hate crime. There is a concern that it will swamp the policy domain. In the UK, there is an estimated 220,000 hate crimes committed each year. That's across 5 monitored characteristics: race, religion, sexual orientation, transgender, and disability. Now, sexual offences alone against women would be about 400,000, as I've just shown. That's just sexual offences. So there is a fear that it would completely swamp the hate crime policy domain, and all of those years of LGBT groups, of disability groups fighting for recognition, fighting for a policy domain that protects them, would be sidelined. Because all of a sudden, millions of crimes would be potentially classified as hate crimes against women. Counter to that, on the flip side, is that actually inclusion would undermine the policy domain that's developed over 20, 30, 40 years that says that domestic violence, that sexual violence is a policy domain in and of itself that really does need specialist police officers, specially trained prosecutors, specially trained prison officers, and so on and so forth. That this knowledge base is developed very carefully over 20 or 30 years. And actually, if we subsume it within hate crime, are we then saying, oh, forget about all of that, we're now just going to treat it as one of the other types of hate crime? We're going to start saying it's all about hostility and hate, and we'll forget about all of the other factors which might cause sexual violence and gender violence in our society. Very quickly, I don't have time to go through these in detail, but if we include sexual violence within hate crime, we might oversimplify it. Sexual violence is highly complex. Yes, it might be about subjugation and power and bias, but it can be about all sorts of different things. Can we provide evidence that will stand up in court to show that, yes, this was a demonstration of gender hostility, yes, this was motivated by gender bias? Or will other causal factors complicate matters, such as offenders who have been sexually abused themselves, offenders who have been psychologically abused in childhood? Are there demonstrations of gendered crime? Are they more about themselves and the pain that they've experienced and the socialisation that they've had? Or are they more about them intending to subjugate and subordinate women? Arguing that out in court is really difficult. We can do it in academia, we can do it in the policy domain, we can have really heated debates about it, but in court, where's the evidence? My argument is, well, yes, we cannot presume that all sexual violence is about hate, but a lot of it will be. And here are some tips as to where that evidence might be if we were to pursue this in law. Was there any vocalised hostility during the commission of the offence, such as the words bitch, slut, whore, etc., aimed to denigrate that victim because of her gender? Was there the presence of acts intended to demean the victim gendered by burning of the breast, mutilation? Sorry if this is a bit graphic. I'm a criminal law lecturer, and these are the kind of cases I teach all the time. It's not very nice. Insertion of objects such as bottles, knives, etc. Some very gory, horrible stuff, but evidence of gender hostility, a history of targeted violence against women, derogatory remarks made during police interviews or during presidential campaigns, for example, possession of internet sources showing abuse of women, victims' own perception. Remember, both Paul and others have spoken about the victim-centered approach to understanding hate crime. Did the victim feel that she was abused because of her gender? And the absence of any other explainable motive. Now, collectively, those can provide quite cogent evidence of demonstrations of gender hostility, which can be used to not only... So what I'm arguing there is that rape wouldn't become relabeled as hate crime, but rape would be labelled as rape that is hate crime, so that you would have two labels there. Okay? So, I know I've run out of time. So rape is often, I think, a form of gender hostility. I think its inclusion within hate crime law may have to challenge some of the gender biases that are events towards women, especially those who are raped, including rape myths. It may help to reorientate blame away from female victims onto those who commit these types of crime. However, I do not believe that all rapes, at least in law, should be relabeled as hate crime, that there needs to be some form of evidence that can be put before a court. And I'm afraid I've run out of time, but if anyone has other questions, some of the other things which I've missed out, which I do provide in the article that accompanies this talk, is the issue of intersectionality, and whether actually if we say that some rapes are hate crimes, do we create a hierarchy of rapes, saying that some rapes are worse than others, and that, of course, is very politically contentious as well. Okay, I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
presentation. We will take with us a lot of these points when we have panel discussions later on. Are there any questions for Mr. Walters?
Well, I have a question. Thank you so much for this. It was really eye-opening. One of the arguments that I've heard in Norway regarding this issue is that, how do I say, hate crime is supposed to protect minority groups. So gender is not a minority. Women are not a minority in any way. So they should not be in the hate crime law or the definition because they're not minority. And this will somehow kind of ruin the hate crime definition and the hate crime law. So do you have any comments?
Yeah, I would say my response to that is women may not be numerically minority, but we often say they are minoritized. That means that they are treated as if they were a minority, and they are subordinated and they are marginalized. So it's not about numbers, it's about whether a group of people are experiencing marginalization and subordination. And I think there's plenty of evidence to show that women are. So they're without power, and they're still without enough social and capital and political power. So yes, they're not a minority in terms of numbers, but as I say, we say that they are minoritized.
Very good. Not
Any
any
more
more
questions?
Stunned you all into silence.
Well, I have a question again. Sorry.
Should we just go?
So what's the status in the UK? I know that gender is not included in any hate crime definitions in Europe, as far as I know. But what's the status in the UK? Are you talking about this? Is this something that's going to come, or?
Yeah, so in the UK, it's working its way up onto the agenda. So these things often happen, don't they, in waves. And so we've had periods of time where we talk about race and racism, and then the next wave was sexual orientation, and the one after that was disability. Gender hasn't really made it onto the agenda until now because it's had its separate policy domain and people working to protect people from domestic violence, sexual violence separately. It's not really come within their thinking that it might also be classified or codified as hate crime until very recently. So in the UK, an area called Nottingham has just introduced misogyny into their definition of hate crime. So Paul was speaking on the first day about police forces in the UK having different definitions of hate crime, so they include different protected characteristics. So there is discussion now across the country as to whether other police forces should also include gender. That doesn't mean that the law's going to change. You might be able to include gender within your policing definition of hate crime, but you won't be able to prosecute it as hate crime. But of course there's lots of issues around intersectionality. So women are often targeted because they're disabled and because they're female, or because of they're Muslim and they're female. So they still fall within some of the hate crime policies. But I think it really requires women's groups and human rights groups to say that this is on the agenda now, this is something that we want to be included for the government to then respond to that. Until you get the civil society organisation saying, we want this, the government won't change. Me writing an article about it is not going to make any difference.
Good, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walters.